a quiet garden, a single rose, and a murder that shattered the peace. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Vela. This community is amazing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. Your voices make this journey unforgettable now. Let's uncover the Rose Garden Murder Mystery. It was a rare day of warmth and sunshine in St. Mary Mead, the kind that coaxed even the most reclusive villagers into their best summer hats. The annual garden party at the vicarage had long been a local institution, a cheerful affair of sponge cakes, raffle tickets, and polite gossip served alongside cups of tea. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Anne Harper, was in her element, bustling about in a floral dress, ensuring the cucumber sandwiches remained fresh and the vicar's collar stayed unrumpled. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a rose-covered pergola, observed the lively scene with her usual serene attentiveness. Her knitting needles clicked gently, though her eyes missed very little. The way young Lily Trent lingered too long near the lemonade stand where Mr. Harold Finch, the new bank clerk, poured drinks with an eager smile, or how Mrs. Amelia Cotterill, the doctor's wife, cast quick, disapproving glances at them both before pretending an interest in the tombola. At precisely 4 o'clock, the rose competition began. The proud exhibitors arranged their blooms upon the long trestle table, the air heavy with the mingled scents of lavender, soil, and anticipation. Mrs. Penelope Gray, a widow of considerable means and even more considerable opinions, was expected to win again this year with her prized Queen of Denmark rose, a claim she had made to anyone who would listen since early spring. "Confidence is admirable," murmured Miss Marple to her friend Mrs. Bantry, "though I've always thought it unwise to tempt fate, particularly in gardens." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You make it sound as though the roses might rebel, Jane." But fate, as Miss Marple well knew, often had a curious sense of humour. The judging commenced, led by Colonel Arthur Melrose, retired and rather pompous, who prided himself on his impartiality. He bent over each bloom with military precision, peering through his spectacles as if inspecting a parade. The crowd leaned forward expectantly when he reached Mrs. Gray's roses. Then came the scream. It was high, sharp, and unmistakably female. All heads turned toward the rose arbour at the far end of the garden, a secluded little alcove where the vicar's cat liked to sun itself. This afternoon, however, it was not a cat that lay upon the ground, but Mrs. Gray herself, collapsed among the fallen petals of her own exhibit. Her wide-brimmed hat had rolled aside, and a single crimson bloom was crushed beneath her gloved hand. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then came the flurry of panic. Gasps, shouts for help, the vicar's hurried prayers. Dr. Cotterill pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the body, his face grim. "She's gone," he said shortly. "Quite gone." Miss Marple rose quietly, folding her knitting and placing it upon her chair. "Dear me," she said softly, "how very tragic. I do hope it wasn't the heat." But her eyes had already noticed what others had not: the small, empty vial half hidden in the grass beside the rose bush, its label neatly torn away. And as the villagers whispered and speculated, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the gathering storm of faces, some pale with shock, others dark with secrets, and she thought with the faintest sigh that this would not be a simple afternoon after all. Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The village reacts, where gossip and suspicions begin to spread through St. Mary Mead. The vicarage garden, once so lively with laughter and chatter, now felt oppressively still. The roses swayed faintly in the afternoon breeze. their beauty made macabre by the tragedy that had just unfolded among them. Mrs. Gray's body had been carried inside by Dr. Cotterell and 2 church wardens, while the remaining guests milled uncertainly about the lawn, speaking in low, nervous tones. Mrs. Harper attempted to restore order with trembling politeness, insisting that everyone please keep calm and refrain from speculation, which naturally had the opposite effect. Within 10 minutes, half the village had formed theories, and most involved poison. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained where she had been, hands folded gently upon her lap. Her blue eyes, clear and unhurried, followed each small movement about the garden. The way young Lily Trent whispered something to her friend beneath the pergola, and looked uneasily toward the house. How Colonel Melrose paced near the trestle table, muttering about a disgraceful affair, and how Mrs. Cotterell stood at her husband's side, pale but unusually composed for a woman who had just witnessed death. "Terrible business," murmured Mrs. Bantry, who had drifted back to Miss Marple's side. "Do you think it could have been her heart?" Miss Marple's fingers moved idly over the handle of her knitting bag. "Perhaps. Though it is curious, is it not, that Mrs. Gray appeared in such excellent health not an hour ago? She was most vigorous in her criticisms of everyone else's roses." Mrs. Bantry gave a small shocked laugh, quickly stifled. "Jane, you can't think—" "My dear, one must think of everything. Human nature, after all, is far less predictable than roses." At that moment Inspector Craddock arrived, a broad-shouldered man with a kind face and a brisk step. He greeted the vicar with appropriate solemnity, and immediately set about questioning those present. Craddock was no stranger to Miss Marple. Indeed, he had once described her with both respect and mild exasperation as the sharpest mind ever hidden beneath a lace shawl. Seeing her seated quietly beneath the pergola, he inclined his head politely. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you saw something useful." "Oh, dear me, I'm afraid not," she replied in her gentle way, "only that Mrs. Gray seemed quite herself until she went to fetch her roses for the competition, and of course I noticed that she was carrying her parasol, though she put it down rather carelessly near the arbour." "Her parasol?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "A charming ivory handle. It rolled a little into the hedge when she fainted, or fell, perhaps." Craddock noted that with a faint furrow of his brow. "We'll have a look. Thank you, Miss Marple." He hesitated, then added, "There was an empty bottle near the scene. The doctor thinks it may have contained poison. We'll send it for testing." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting toward the rose bushes where petals still clung to the trampled grass. "Poison! Such a cowardly way, don't you think? Yet rather common when one considers human ingenuity." Inside the vicarage drawing-room, the air was heavy with the mingled scents of roses and polish. Mrs. Harper moved about distractedly, pouring tea for the shaken guests who had been asked to remain for questioning. Colonel Melrose sat stiffly in an armchair, his moustache bristling with indignation. "Shocking affair," he declared. "Disgraceful to have it happen at the vicarage of all places. Damned nuisance for the roses, too. Poor show for next year's competition." Mrs. Cotterell looked at him sharply. "You speak as though that's what matters most, Colonel." "I speak as a man who believes in order, madam," he said, flushing. "This sort of scandal unsettles everyone. There'll be gossip all over the county by evening." "There already is," murmured Miss Marple, who had quietly taken a seat near the window, "and gossip, in my experience, travels faster than any carriage." The remark caused a brief, uneasy silence. Outside, the police moved methodically across the lawn, marking spots and collecting what they termed evidence. One constable returned with the ivory-handled parasol Miss Marple had mentioned, wrapped neatly in a handkerchief. Craddock entered again, looking grave. "The doctor confirms it," he announced. "Mrs. Gray was poisoned. Digitalis, by the smell of it. By the smell of it." "Good heavens," said Mrs. Bantry. "That's heart medicine, isn't it?" "Indeed," Craddock replied. "The doctor keeps it at the surgery, locked away. It's not something easily come by." All eyes turned toward Dr. Cotterill, who stiffened slightly. "Are you implying—" "Merely stating the facts, sir," said Craddock calmly. "We'll need to confirm whether any of it has gone missing." Mrs. Cotterill's hand trembled as she reached for her teacup. "Arthur, please," she said softly. "They're only doing their duty." Miss Marple watched the exchange with quiet thoughtfulness. Then, almost absently, she said, "It does make one wonder, doesn't it, how such a substance might find its way into something as innocent as a garden party. Lemonade, perhaps, or the little sponge cakes." Craddock's head turned sharply. "You think it was ingested?" "Oh, I wouldn't presume to know," said Miss Marple mildly. "But people do tend to grow careless when there's competition involved. Pride can be dreadfully distracting." Her words hung in the air, delicate as spider silk, while the others shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Harper, desperate to change the subject, said brightly, "I must say, Mrs. Gray seemed particularly cross with young Lily Trent earlier. Something about pruning or watering, I forget which." "Yes," said Colonel Melrose darkly. "Caught her near the roses this morning, didn't she? Could have tampered with them then." "Tampered?" gasped Mrs. Harper. "Colonel, she's just a girl." "Girls can be impulsive," he said grimly, "especially when there's jealousy involved. Everyone knows Mrs. Gray had words with her about Mr. Finch." At this, Lily flushed scarlet. "That's not true," she cried. "Mrs. Gray only accused me of stealing her fertilizer, and I didn't. I'd never harm her or anyone." Mr. Finch, flustered, stood up awkwardly. Now, Lily, there's no need to upset yourself." "Upset myself?" she said near tears. "You don't understand. She threatened to tell Mr. Harper I'd been neglecting the church flowers. Said I was lazy and disrespectful. She hated me." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "My dear, hatred is a very strong word, though I dare say Mrs. Gray was not known for her sweetness of temper. Still, those who make enemies often forget how very easily resentment can take root, rather like bindweed in a border." Inspector Craddock observed the scene with professional detachment, but even he could sense the tension in the room. The lines between grief and guilt, outrage and fear, were already beginning to blur. By evening, word of the tragedy had reached every corner of St. Mary Mead. The postmistress was the first to declare that Mrs. Gray had been mixed up in something shady, and within hours the grocer, the butcher, and even the milkman had each improved upon the story in their own way. It was said she had quarrelled with her late husband's solicitor, that she'd been blackmailing someone over a will, that she'd planned to move away and leave her house to a foreign gentleman. Miss Marple, however, preferred not to listen to the wilder tales. Instead, she spent the evening walking slowly through her garden at home, her small frame outlined against the twilight. She paused beside her own rosebeds, bending to examine a petal fallen on the path. "Digitalis," she murmured softly to herself. "Such a beautiful plant, and such a deadly one. One never knows what might be growing under the most respectable hedges." The next morning brought fresh revelations. Inspector Craddock called at the doctor's surgery and confirmed that a small bottle of digitalis tincture was indeed missing. Dr. Cotterill insisted he had last used it 3 days ago, but his assistant could not recall locking the cabinet afterward. Meanwhile, at the village shop, Mrs. Cotterill was seen purchasing a new pair of gloves and exchanging a few strained words with Lily Trent, who avoided her eyes. Mrs. Harper, ever eager to be helpful, reported both incidents to the inspector before luncheon. By afternoon, suspicion had settled like fog upon the village. Some believed Lily guilty out of youthful folly. Others whispered that Mrs. Cotterell's calm was unnatural. Colonel Melrose hinted loudly that poison was a woman's weapon, though Miss Marple noted wryly that men had never hesitated to use it when convenient. That evening, as the vicar led prayers for the deceased, Miss Marple sat quietly in the pew near the back, her eyes half closed in reflection. The hymn echoed softly through the church, the voices rising in solemn unison. Yet her thoughts were not on heaven, but on human hearts, fragile, foolish things, capable of both kindness and cruelty. She recalled the parasol again, the ivory handle faintly smudged, as though with powder, and the empty vial whose torn label had revealed just enough to suggest intent rather than accident. As she left the church, she paused beneath the yew tree, watching the villagers disperse into the misty dusk. The truth, she thought, was already blooming, slowly, inevitably, like a rosebud in summer. It only needed the right moment to open. The following morning dawned grey and close, a fine mist lying over the cottages of St. Mary Mead, like gauze over a patient's face. The tragedy of the garden party had not lost its hold upon the village. Indeed, by breakfast time, the incident had matured into legend. The local gossip chain, Mrs. Price at the post office, Mr. Sims the butcher, and old Mrs. Bartlett, who swept the church steps, had already refined the tale to perfection. Mrs. Gray had been murdered for love, for money, for revenge, or perhaps simply for spite. Each theory, depending on its teller, sounded equally plausible and equally absurd. At the vicarage, the aftermath of death lingered in every corner. Mrs. Harper had scarcely slept. Her husband had spent the night writing letters to the bishop, apologizing for the unfortunate scene. Even the cat seemed subdued, curling beneath the hearth instead of venturing near the rose arbour where it used to doze. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 8, politely declining breakfast but accepting a cup of tea. "Such a comfort, Miss Marple," Mrs. Harper said wearily, clutching the cup. "Everything feels so unsettled. The police have been coming and going, and poor Lily Trent has been in tears half the morning. She insists she's innocent, but one can't help wondering—" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Oh, I am sure the girl means no harm, but innocence, my dear Mrs. Harper, is not always accompanied by prudence. There's a difference, you know." Mrs. Harper looked puzzled, but before she could reply, the doorbell rang. It was Inspector Craddock, looking unusually serious. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Mrs. Harper. I'm afraid there have been developments." He removed his hat and drew a folded paper from his pocket. "The laboratory confirmed the poison, digitalis, as we suspected. A concentrated tincture, enough to kill in a single swallow. We also found traces of it on the inside rim of a teacup. Mrs. Gray's, we believe." Mrs. Harper's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, dear heavens! Then it wasn't in the food or lemonade?" "No, the poison was administered directly to her cup. It appears she poured herself a fresh serving of tea shortly before the judging began. We have witnesses who saw her at the refreshment table." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the wet roses glimmered faintly through the mist. "How very deliberate," she murmured. "It suggests knowledge, both of her habits and of her vulnerability." Craddock nodded. "Indeed, and as it happens, Mrs. Gray was known to take a spoonful of sugar with every cup. Only hers, mind you. She never trusted other people to do it properly. The sugar bowl on the table contained several cubes dusted with digitalis powder. We believe one was placed there intentionally." Mrs. Harper gasped. You mean any of us might have taken it? Craddock's mouth tightened. It seems whoever planned it knew exactly which cube she would choose. That sort of precision implies opportunity, observation, and a degree of boldness. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Her fingers rested lightly upon the saucer before her, tracing the rim in small, absent circles. People often reveal themselves through small habits, she said at last. A certain way of stirring tea, or cutting bread, or even trimming roses. We think such gestures meaningless, but they are the very essence of character. Craddock, accustomed to her elliptical reasoning, inclined his head politely. I'll keep that in mind. He hesitated, then added, We've also discovered something else. Mrs. Gray's will has gone missing. Her solicitor in Market Down says she recently made changes, significant ones, but the document can't be found among her papers. Mrs. Harper looked stricken. You don't suppose murder for inheritance? How dreadful! Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Dreadful, yes, but not uncommon. Money, like love, tends to make people imaginative. After Craddock departed, Miss Marple took her leave as well. But instead of returning home, she wandered slowly along the lane toward the late Mrs. Gray's cottage, known as Rosebank. The gate stood slightly ajar, the gravel path scattered with petals blown from the garden. It was a handsome little house, proper and self-satisfied, much like its former owner. The blinds were drawn, but a constable stood guard outside. I wonder, Miss Marple said mildly, if I might take a small look at the garden, purely from botanical interest, you understand. The constable, young and unused to denying elderly ladies, stepped aside uncertainly. So long as you don't touch anything, ma'am. Don't touch anything, ma'am. Don't touch any. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and stepped through. The rose beds were immaculate, each bush labelled, pruned, and fed with an attention bordering on obsession. Yet here and there she noticed irregularities. A broken stem, a disturbed patch of soil, a spade left leaning against the fence. She crouched delicately beside a clump of foxglove, the tall purple blooms swaying faintly in the air. Digitalis, she murmured. How very convenient, and so very ornamental. As she straightened, she caught sight of something glinting in the earth, a small silver button, tarnished and half buried near the hedge. She considered it for a moment, then called softly to the constable. My dear young man, I believe this may belong to someone. Best give it to Inspector Craddock when he returns. Leaving the garden, she walked toward the village shop, where she found Lily Trent behind the counter, pale and red-eyed. Oh, Miss Marple, she whispered, I didn't do it. Truly, I didn't. Everyone's looking at me as though I had. Mrs. Cotterill came in this morning and wouldn't even meet my eyes. Miss Marple gave her a sympathetic look. My dear, people are frightened of what they don't understand. Tell me, did you happen to see Mrs. Gray's tea prepared at the party? Lily frowned, thinking. Not really. She made such a fuss about her tea being too weak. I was helping with the cakes, and when I came back, she was already pouring. Mr. Finch was there. He offered to fetch her another spoon, but she waved him off. Ah, said Miss Marple softly. And did she speak to anyone before before the incident? She said something to Mrs. Cotterill, I think. They argued about something silly, like they always did. But Mrs. Cotterill looked different somehow, cold. I thought she might cry later, only she didn't. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful. Do try to keep busy. Idle hands make for anxious minds. Outside, the air had grown heavier, promising rain. Miss Marple continued her walk toward the surgery. She found Dr. Cotterill at his desk, sorting papers with nervous precision. His wife sat nearby, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. "Miss Marple," the doctor said curtly, "I assume you've come to satisfy your curiosity." "Oh, not curiosity," she said mildly, "merely an interest in patterns. You see, I have long noticed that when a thing appears quite straightforward, it rarely is. For example, a missing will, a missing vial, and a death that seems far too convenient." Mrs. Cotterell's face went pale. "Are you accusing us, Miss Marple?" "Certainly not," she said kindly. "I merely observe, though I do wonder how the digitalis went missing. You mentioned your assistant left the cabinet unlocked." The doctor nodded stiffly. "He's a fool. I've reprimanded him. And was Mrs. Gray ever prescribed digitalis?" "No," he said shortly. "She was perfectly healthy. Only vanity and temper." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, yes, vanity can be most inconvenient. One wonders, then, what use such a bottle would have been to anyone else." Neither Cotterill spoke. A clock ticked somewhere, precise and relentless. After a moment, Miss Marple rose. "I shan't trouble you further, though if I may offer a word of advice, Doctor, it is sometimes safer to lock more than just cabinets." As she left, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Cotterell's face reflected in the surgery glass. Rigid, drawn, and terrified. It was not the face of a murderer, Miss Marple thought, but perhaps of someone who knew far too much. That evening, the rain broke, drumming softly on cottage roofs. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting half forgotten on her lap, her mind arranging details as neatly as stitches. The missing will, the silver button, the poisoned sugar cube, the argument by the roses. Each seemed small alone, yet together they formed a pattern of fear, opportunity, and something else beneath it all, betrayal. She leaned back, eyes half closed, and murmured, "People do not kill for nothing. They kill for what they believe is rightfully theirs, or for what they cannot bear to lose." Outside, thunder rolled distantly over the hills, and somewhere in the darkness, a truth long buried began to stir. The rain continued through the night, soft at first, then turning into a steady drumming that filled the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead with the muted sound of water and wind. By morning, the puddles in the cobbled street reflected a sky the colour of pewter, and the whole village seemed to have sunk into an uneasy hush. The scandal of Mrs. Gray's death had grown into something heavier, an air of dread that seemed to hover over every doorstep. No one looked anyone else fully in the eye. The postmistress barely greeted customers. At the bakery, hushed voices fell silent whenever someone entered. The thought of poison, such a deliberate, intimate method, had unsettled even the most sensible of residents. At her little cottage on Old Mill Lane, Miss Marple set a tray on the table by her window. It was precisely 8 o'clock. She poured herself tea and unfolded the morning paper, though her mind was far from the printed page. Her thoughts, like the fog outside, moved quietly over what she knew. A cup of tea deliberately poisoned, a missing will, a silver button found in a rose bed, and a village thick with secrets. Every piece had weight, yet none settled comfortably into place. A knock came at the door, a brisk, familiar rhythm. "Come in, Inspector," she said before he could announce himself. Craddock entered, raincoat damp, hat in hand. "You've saved me the trouble, Miss Marple." "I should have known," she smiled faintly. "I generally do know who's at my door, Inspector. One learns such things living in a small village. Now do sit down. You look as though you've had an early start." He accepted the chair gratefully. "We've been through Mrs. Gray's papers. Her solicitor was right. There's no sign of the new will. But we did find this." He produced a sealed envelope, the flap broken, the paper slightly damp. It was hidden in a recipe book. Mrs. Gray wrote it herself, apparently. Dated 2 weeks ago. It's not a legal will, but it makes clear she intended to disinherit her nephew, Peter Gray, and leave the house to, of all people, Mrs. Cotterill. Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully. How very interesting. Mrs. Cotterill, you say? I'd rather thought the two women disliked one another. That's what makes it strange. No one seems to understand why. The husband didn't know a thing about it. Claims his wife was shocked when I told her. Perhaps she was, Miss Marple murmured. Though shock can be a convenient cloak. People are rarely honest when they're frightened, Inspector. Craddock leaned forward, frowning. You think she's involved? I think, she said gently, that she is protecting someone. The question, of course, is whom? He looked sceptical. She doesn't strike me as the protective sort. Too controlled. Too careful. But control is often a disguise for fear. I've known women who seemed carved from stone, yet every gesture trembled beneath the surface. Fear makes one quiet, Inspector. It makes one precise. He regarded her with that expression she had seen before, half admiration, half impatience. Well, I'll keep an eye on her all the same. And there's something else. The missing vial of digitalis has turned up, found behind a stack of medical ledgers in the surgery. No fingerprints worth noting, too much handling. But the dust suggests it was replaced after the search, not before. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. Replaced? How curious! It implies a guilty conscience, or a very cunning mind. You see, Inspector, truly innocent people rarely tidy up after crimes they didn't commit. Craddock chuckled dryly. That's one way of putting it. He rose, putting on his hat. We're bringing the Cotterills in for formal questioning this afternoon. And Finch, too, the bank clerk. He was seen near Mrs. Gray's cottage the day before the garden party. Claims he was there on business, but the details are vague. Mr. Finch, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. A polite young man, rather too eager to please, perhaps. I dare say he's been popular among certain of our ladies. The inspector gave her a wry look. You always know more than you let on, Miss Marple smiled. One simply listens, Inspector. The truth is most often told accidentally. After he left, she sat for some time without moving, watching the rain bead and roll down the glass. She thought of Mrs. Cotterill's gloved hands, of Lily's frightened face, and of the silver button gleaming faintly in the damp soil. Then she rose, took her umbrella, and set out toward the village green. By the time she reached the tea shop, the rain had thinned to a mist. Mrs. Bantry was already there, seated at her usual table, surrounded by newspapers and the satisfied air of someone in possession of half a dozen theories. My dear Jane, she exclaimed, have you heard? They're saying Mrs. Cotterill and Mrs. Gray were closer than anyone suspected. The butcher's wife claims she saw them meeting secretly last month, though whether to quarrel or conspire is anyone's guess. Honestly, this village could fill volumes. Miss Marple ordered tea and scones. Rumours are like ivy, Dolly. They grow fastest where the ground is weakest. Still, I do wonder what truly bound those two women together. Friendship? Guilt? Or perhaps gratitude of a very inconvenient kind? Mrs. Bantry blinked. Gratitude? Oh yes. One must never underestimate the trouble caused by a favour owed, particularly between women. As they spoke, the tea-shop door opened and Lily Trent came in, cheeks flushed from the damp. She hesitated when she saw them, then hurried over. Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock says they might arrest Mrs. Cotterill. I told him she couldn't have done it. She's not like that. Miss Marple regarded her gently. You seem quite sure, my dear. Have you reason to be? Lily bit her lip. I don't know. Only that she was kind to me once. After my mother died, she gave me money for the flowers on the church altar. Said no one should grieve without beauty. Her eyes filled suddenly. But Mrs. Gray found out and said dreadful things. Told her she was wasting pity on a girl who didn't deserve it. Miss Marple's voice was soft. And did Mrs. Cotterell reply? Lily nodded. She said some people mistake cruelty for strength. Then she walked away. That's all. Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand. Thank you, child. You've told me something very important. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended the inquest, sitting quietly in the back as Inspector Craddock questioned each witness. Mr. Finch was nervous, his hands twisting a handkerchief into shreds. He admitted to visiting Mrs. Gray's cottage to deliver a bank notice, but denied any personal connection. His alibi for the afternoon of the garden party, helping Lily arrange tables, was confirmed, though his unease made him appear guiltier than he likely was. Mrs. Cotterell, by contrast, was composed. Her answers were brief, her tone calm. She admitted to quarrelling with Mrs. Gray over a personal matter, but refused to elaborate. When asked about the will, she looked straight ahead and said she knew nothing of it until the inspector told her. Yet when Craddock mentioned the foxgloves growing in Mrs. Gray's garden, she flinched ever so slightly, a flicker of emotion too swift for most to notice. Miss Marple saw it. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple approached her. "My dear Mrs. Cotterell," she said pleasantly, "I do hope you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, but it must have been quite a shock, learning that Mrs. Gray intended to leave you her home." Mrs. Cotterell's gloved hands tightened on her purse. "I never asked for it. I wanted nothing from her." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "and yet perhaps she wanted something from you. Forgiveness, perhaps, or silence?" For a moment something flickered in the younger woman's eyes, fear, guilt, or both. Then she turned abruptly and walked away into the grey afternoon. Miss Marple watched her go, thoughtful. She had seen that same look before. In another village, another year, when a woman's pride had hidden a terrible truth. She knew now what bound Mrs. Cotterell and Mrs. Gray. A shared secret, one buried years before, and now unearthed by greed and shame. As she walked home, the church bell struck 5, echoing across the damp air. In the distance, a figure moved hurriedly down the lane toward Rosebank. Mr. Finch, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Miss Marple paused, frowning slightly. Whatever he sought there, it was not banking business. By the time the sun set, faint and watery behind the clouds, she had decided her next step. There was still one piece missing, the reason behind Mrs. Gray's sudden generosity. And to find it, Miss Marple knew, she would need to look not in the present, but in the quiet, forgotten years of the past. For in St. Mary Mead, sins were like roots beneath old roses, unseen, but always growing. The following day dawned clearer, though the village remained subdued, as if afraid to breathe too freely after so much unpleasantness. The roses, drenched from the recent rain, stood heavy-headed in the gardens, their beauty dulled by dampness. Miss Marple, however, was up early, her mind as alert as ever. She had spent much of the previous night in quiet thought, her knitting untouched, her mind moving through the puzzle with the calm precision of someone accustomed to the darker corners of human nature. She had not yet spoken her conclusions aloud. Indeed, they were not yet conclusions, merely inklings, but she sensed she was drawing near to the heart of the matter. She had seen it before, the small village crime that began in gossip and pride and ended in ruin. The pattern, though infinitely varied, was always human. Pettiness disguised as virtue, guilt hidden beneath duty, love warped by fear. And in this case, she felt sure the truth lay in the long, secret thread that bound Mrs. Gray and Mrs. Cotterell. At 9 o'clock she set out, walking briskly down the lane toward Market Down, her straw hat tied securely beneath her chin. She had made an appointment, of a sort, with Mr. Pendleton, Mrs. Gray's solicitor, who had known her for many years, and had learned that Miss Marple's inquiries, though gentle in tone, were rarely without purpose. His office was a tidy room above the post office, smelling faintly of ink and dust. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, rising politely. "I rather wondered when you'd turn up. Everyone in St. Mary Mead seems to have developed a passion for legal matters since poor Mrs. Gray's demise." "I dare say they have," she replied, settling into the chair opposite. "It's remarkable how tragedy sharpens one's interest in paperwork. I'm afraid I've come to trouble you for a small clarification." He smiled faintly. "I suspected as much. What would you like to know?" "Only this. Why Mrs. Gray should wish to alter her will so suddenly, and to such an unlikely beneficiary. You see, it strikes one as quite unnatural." Pendleton leaned back, considering. Unnatural, yes, but not inexplicable. Mrs. Gray was not, shall we say, a woman of steady affections. She quarrelled easily, reconciled easily, and often acted upon impulse. She came to me about a fortnight ago, most insistent that her nephew Peter be removed from the will. Something about an argument over money, I believe. As for Mrs. Cotterill, she spoke of being indebted to her. Some old matter, vague but emotional. She said, "She once did me a kindness when no one else would." That was all. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "A kindness," she repeated. "How easily people forget that kindness can wound as much as cruelty." "Indeed, though I must add, she seemed almost frightened when she spoke of it. I asked whether she wished to delay, but she refused. She signed the new document and left in a state of agitation. I sent it to her cottage for safekeeping, as she insisted she'd keep it there until it could be formally filed. Then, of course, she was dead within the week, and no sign of the document since." "None," Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it was not meant to be found." She thanked him and left, walking slowly back through the village. The morning light had softened, catching on the wet hedges and the glittering cobblestones. Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Cotterill. The calm face, the steady hands, the unmistakable flicker of fear when confronted. Yes, there was guilt there, but not the guilt of murder. Something older, heavier, buried deep beneath years of silence. By the time she reached the green, she found herself intercepted by Mrs. Bantry, hurrying toward her with the air of one bearing important news. "Jane, you'll never guess. They've arrested someone, Mr. Finch." Miss Marple stopped, her expression unchanged. "Ah, poor young man. And what reason have they given?" "Inspector Craddock says they found a key to Mrs. Gray's cottage in his desk drawer. He claims she lent it to him to check the boiler, but no one believes him. And apparently someone saw him lurking near the garden again last night." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church spire in the distance. "Yes, I rather thought something like that might happen. It's convenient, you see, when a person looks guilty enough to spare the trouble of real thought." Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "You don't think he did it? My dear, he may be foolish, but foolishness rarely breeds murder. No, I think Mr. Finch is being used, quite cleverly too. The question is by whom?" Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the police station, where Inspector Craddock greeted her with weary resignation. "I suppose you're here to tell me I've arrested the wrong man. I shouldn't dream of it," she said pleasantly, "though it might be wise to ask yourself why a man would return to the scene of a crime if he were guilty. They rarely do, you know. It's far more common for the innocent to go back, out of worry, or curiosity, or fear of what others might think." Craddock sighed. "You always make it sound so simple, Miss Marple. But we've got evidence, the key, his strange behaviour. The fact that he had no real alibi for the evening before Mrs. Gray's death. "And yet," she said softly, "no motive, unless you believe he loved her roses enough to kill her for pruning them too harshly. He almost smiled despite himself. "Then what do you think?" "I think," she said slowly, "that someone is tidying up after themselves again. First the missing vial returned to its shelf, and now a key placed neatly in Mr. Finch's drawer. It's all rather too orderly, wouldn't you say?" Craddock rubbed his chin. "You believe someone's framing him?" "I believe someone is frightened, and clever enough to use another's folly as a shield. But frightened people make mistakes. They overlook the smallest things, and it is always the smallest things that matter most." When she left the station, twilight had begun to fall. The street lamps flickered one by one, and the damp air carried the faint scent of roses. Fainter now, fading with the season. She walked slowly toward the churchyard, where the stones gleamed pale beneath the rising mist. It was quiet there, save for the rustle of the yew branches and the distant toll of the hour. As she passed the gate, she noticed a figure kneeling near the older graves. Mrs. Cotterill. Her gloved hands rested on a weathered stone, her posture still and strained. Miss Marple hesitated, then approached softly. "Good evening, my dear," paying respects. Mrs. Cotterill started, then composed herself. "My parents," she said quickly. "I come here often." "How dutiful," said Miss Marple kindly. "The living so rarely visit the dead unless they're searching for peace or forgiveness." The younger woman's eyes flickered upward, uncertain. "I suppose you mean something by that." "Only that some wounds never close, however prettily one tends them." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the headstone. "It's curious, isn't it, how Mrs. Gray's kindness was so selective. She helped some, but never without a price. I believe you knew that better than anyone." Mrs. Cotterill drew in a sharp breath. "You don't know what you're saying." "Oh, but I think I do. It was years ago, wasn't it? A child, a scandal, and a woman desperate to keep her place. Mrs. Gray lent her aid and her silence, but she never let you forget it. A debt paid, but never forgiven. Am I close?" The other woman turned pale as the stone beside her. "She threatened me," she whispered. "After all these years, she said she'd tell. Said she'd ruin everything. Arthur's practice, our life here. She enjoyed it, you see. The power." Miss Marple's expression was full of quiet compassion. "Yes, she would. I've known her kind before. And that, I think, is why she left you her house. Not as a gift, but as punishment. To remind you that you owed her still." Tears filled Mrs. Cotterill's eyes. "I didn't kill her," she said fiercely. "I swear it. I wanted to for one awful moment, but I couldn't. I went to the rose arbor to confront her, to beg her to stop, but she was already dead. I saw the cup on the ground. I ran." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I believe you, my dear, but the one who poisoned that cup counted on you being too afraid to speak. And now, with poor Mr. Finch accused, that person feels quite safe." For the moment, Mrs. Cotterill looked at her in despair. "Who could it be, then?" "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is what we shall soon find out." As she walked back through the village, the lamps glowing faintly through the mist, Miss Marple's thoughts were calm but certain. The pattern was complete now, almost. Only one thread remained unseen, one hand behind the tidiness of guilt, and she meant to tug at it gently until the whole pretty tapestry came undone. The morning after Miss Marple's meeting with Mrs. Cotterill broke sharp and clear, the mist having lifted to reveal a pale autumn sun hanging low over the village. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, a deceptive calm that belied the unease pulsing beneath St. Mary Mead's respectable surface. Word of Mr. Finch's arrest had spread overnight, and the villagers, ever hungry for conclusion, now spoke of the case as though it were settled. The bank clerk's nervous disposition, his solitary habits, and his proximity to the late Mrs. Gray's garden had combined conveniently into what they all preferred to believe. A simple crime, neatly tied. But Miss Marple, who understood that human nature rarely lent itself to neatness, felt only a growing sense of disquiet. She had spent much of the early morning tending to her chrysanthemums, her small hands moving deftly among the blooms, while her mind traced invisible patterns. It was not Mr. Finch's guilt that troubled her, but the precision with which he had been framed, the careful placement of the key, the too obvious trail of suspicion. It was all so deliberate, so tidy, and tidy, she knew, was rarely innocent. When she set out for the village that morning, her destination was not the police station, as one might have supposed, but the vicarage. Mrs. Harper had sent word that she was quite distraught over recent events, and begged Miss Marple to come for tea. Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Harper's distress had less to do with grief, and more to do with curiosity, a very human sort of suffering. The vicar's wife received her in the morning-room, wringing her lace handkerchief and speaking in rapid, flustered tones. "I don't know how the village will recover from this, Miss Marple. Truly, I don't. Such a scandal, here of all places. Poor Mr. Harper hasn't been able to think of anything but his sermon, and I've had to cancel the flower committee meeting, because no one will sit next to Mrs. Cotterill. They say she's been seen crying in the churchyard. Oh, it's too dreadful." Miss Marple took her tea calmly. "I dare say time will smooth it over, as it always does. Tragedies lose their sharpness once there's gossip to replace them." Mrs. Harper blinked, taken aback by the bluntness. "You make it sound so unfeeling." "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "Merely human. People prefer stories they can understand to truths that disturb them. That is why I am rather afraid poor Mr. Finch's innocence may not matter to them at all." Mrs. Harper's eyes widened. "You don't think he did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, I think he couldn't poison a spider, let alone a widow. But someone wanted us to think he could. Tell me, Mrs. Harper, did Mrs. Gray have any visitors during the week before her death?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, thinking, "Why, yes, Mr. Finch, of course, about her accounts. And Dr. Cotterill, I believe. He came to check her blood pressure. Oh, and how odd I should forget Colonel Melrose. He stopped by to discuss something about the rose competition. I remember because Mrs. Gray complained afterward that he'd been insufferably condescending." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "How fortunate that Colonel Melrose has such a sense of duty toward the village's horticultural excellence." The rest of their conversation drifted into harmless domesticities, but Miss Marple's mind was far from the vicarage drawing-room. As she walked back through the lane, she thought of Colonel Melrose, the pompous ex-soldier with a fondness for order, rules and appearances. He had been at the garden party close enough to see the judging table, to observe Mrs. Gray's habits, to handle the tea things perhaps. He had also been first to comment on Lily Trent's supposed jealousy, directing suspicion away from the older generation. By noon, Miss Marple was making her way toward Melrose House, a sturdy Georgian building set slightly apart from the rest of the village, its lawn trimmed with military precision. The Colonel himself answered her knock, his moustache bristling and his manner as brisk as ever. "Ah, Miss Marple, come in, come in. You've come about the roses, I suppose. Can't blame you. Mine have suffered dreadfully with all this rain." "Roses do prefer stability," she said mildly, stepping inside. "Quite unlike people who seem to thrive on upheaval." He chuckled, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Still worrying about that unfortunate business, are you? I dare say the police have things well in hand. Silly young fellow, that Finch. The village will rest easier once he's properly charged." Miss Marple regarded him with gentle patience. "You speak with such certainty, Colonel. One might almost think you were there when it happened." "Well, of course I was," he said, frowning. "Everyone knows I was one of the judges. Dashed unpleasant business, though. I've been trying to forget the whole thing." "Ah, but forgetting is so difficult when one has seen something truly important," she said. "For instance, I was told you stopped by Mrs. Gray's cottage before the garden party. How very diligent of you." The Colonel stiffened slightly. "Routine matter, I assure you. I'd offered to inspect her roses, make sure she wasn't using those foreign fertilizers again. The rules are clear, of course." "Rules must be upheld," Miss Marple agreed. "And I suppose you had tea while you were there. Mrs. Gray was always generous with her hospitality." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Yes, I had a cup. Can't recall much about it." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. Only that she kept her sugar in a small porcelain bowl with pink flowers. A pretty thing. I wondered whether she'd had it out that day." Something flickered across his face, too quickly to name, but there nonetheless. "Possibly," he said curtly. "I don't notice such trifles." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Trifles often notice us, Colonel. They tend to linger in the memory of others. She stayed only a few minutes longer, long enough to remark politely upon his garden, and to note the fresh earth near the tool shed. When she finally took her leave, she did so with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The pieces were beginning to align. The poison that had been taken from the doctor's cabinet, the missing will that no one could find, and now the Colonel's nervousness at the mention of tea and sugar. As she passed through the village on her way home, she encountered Inspector Craddock emerging from the police station. "I was just coming to see you," he said. "We've had a development. The will's been found." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "How convenient. And where, may I ask?" "In a hollow behind the mantel at Rosebank, hidden inside an old book. Our constable stumbled upon it by chance. Dated and signed just as the solicitor said. Leaves everything to Mrs. Cotterill." "How tidy," she said softly. "Almost too tidy, wouldn't you agree?" Craddock grimaced. "You think it was planted?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it was meant to be found now, and not before. Whoever placed it there wanted suspicion to rest upon Mrs. Cotterill again, perhaps to make certain that no one looks too closely elsewhere." They stood in silence for a moment as the church clock struck 2. Craddock rubbed his temple. "I swear, Miss Marple, this case grows more confounded by the hour. If you've any bright ideas, now would be a good time." "Oh, not bright ideas," she said modestly. "Just old memories. I once knew a man, much like your Colonel Melrose, who thought order could conceal guilt as easily as it concealed dust. He was mistaken, of course." The inspector gave her a sharp look. "You think Melrose is involved? I think he knows more than he admits. And I think," she added, her voice lowering, "that he was the only person who could have placed that sugar bowl where it would do its work unnoticed. A man accustomed to giving orders expects to be obeyed without question. It would have been simplicity itself." Craddock frowned deeply. "That's a bold claim." "Not yet a claim, Inspector. Merely a thought. But you might find it worthwhile to ask where he spent the evening after Mrs. Gray's death. Some men tidy their gardens when troubled. Others tidy their consciences." That evening, as dusk deepened over the village, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting laid aside once more. The flames danced upon her face, catching the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. She had sown her words carefully, as one sows seeds before the rain. Now she would wait, patient as ever, for what would grow from them. Outside, a wind began to rise, rustling through the rose bushes and bending the chimney smoke sideways. In Colonel Melrose's house at the edge of the green, a lamp burned late into the night, and though no one in the village could hear it, somewhere within that quiet, ordered home, a drawer opened softly. A drawer that held a small porcelain bowl, its pink flowers dulled by dust, and a single cube of sugar, untouched, glittering faintly in the lamplight. The following morning brought with it a deceptive calm, a sunlight that gilded the rooftops and turned the puddles in the lanes to patches of pale gold. To the casual observer, St. Mary Mead appeared restored to its ordinary rhythm. Milk carts rattled along the cobbles, the postmistress opened her shutters, and Mrs. Bantry was seen directing her gardener with her usual brisk energy. Yet beneath the outward peace, the village hummed with speculation. The discovery of Mrs. Gray's will had rekindled every whisper and rumour. Some swore that Mrs. Cotterell's tears in the churchyard were those of guilt. Others claimed that the will had been forged altogether, and there were even those who whispered, quietly, but with relish, that Miss Marple herself was meddling too much for comfort. In her small parlour, Miss Marple sipped her tea and watched the morning unfold through the lace curtain. She was not immune to the weight of gossip. She simply regarded it as a kind of weather, inevitable, shifting, and occasionally useful. The events of the previous evening, the look in Colonel Melrose's eyes when she had spoken of the sugar bowl, lingered in her mind. It had not been fear she saw there, not precisely. It was something subtler, a flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. She had seen it before, in people who thought their secrets had been safely buried long ago. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Craddock, looking tired but resolute. "Miss Marple," he began, stepping inside at her invitation. "I thought you'd want to know. We questioned Melrose this morning. He admits to visiting Mrs. Gray's cottage the day before she died. Claims he merely checked her roses, had a cup of tea, and left. Denies knowing anything about the poison or the will." "And how did he seem?" she asked, folding her hands neatly. "Agitated," Craddock replied. "Kept saying the village had gone mad, that it was a disgrace to turn on a man of his standing. He nearly shouted at me when I mentioned the sugar bowl. Swore he hadn't touched it. Said he's never even noticed such trifles in his life." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Ah, but you see, that's precisely what troubles me. The truly innocent remember trifles. They must. Only those who are uneasy forget the little things. They fear to seem too knowing." Craddock groaned softly. "You'll make a philosopher of me yet. I should hope a detective," she said gently. "A philosopher is of little use without facts. Tell me, Inspector, did you notice anything peculiar in his home? Anything out of place?" He hesitated. "Funny you should ask. The constable who accompanied me mentioned a smell, slight but noticeable, like crushed leaves," he said. "I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Crushed leaves? Of a medicinal sort? Possibly." "He didn't specify." She rose thoughtful. "Foxglove, Inspector. That's what it would smell like. Fresh digitalis leaves. You'll recall that Mrs. Gray grew them in abundance. I do wonder how such a scent came to linger in the Colonel's sitting room." Craddock's eyes widened. "You think he kept some? To what end?" "Ah, that is the puzzle. Vanity, perhaps, or guilt, or, more likely, necessity. A tidy mind like Colonel Melrose's does not do things by halves. If he used the poison, he would have ensured there was more at hand, just in case his first attempt failed. It is the way of men accustomed to control." The inspector frowned. "But why Mrs. Gray? What could he gain?" Miss Marple returned to her chair, her voice soft. "Respectability can be as deadly a motive as greed, Inspector. You see, Mrs. Gray's cruelty was not confined to Mrs. Cotterell. She knew secrets, old ones, the sort of things that could undo a man who has spent his life maintaining his reputation. I suspect she reminded Colonel Melrose of something he preferred forgotten. Craddock looked at her with reluctant admiration. "You make it sound almost poetic." "It's only human nature," she said, "and human nature is very rarely poetic." By midday, the inspector had gone to arrange a quiet search of the Colonel's property, and Miss Marple, as was her habit, decided to take a walk through the village. Her path took her past the churchyard, where the ivy clung thickly to the stone walls, and down toward the green, where Lily Trent stood outside the post office, pale and uncertain. The girl looked up quickly as Miss Marple approached. "Oh, Miss Marple, is it true?" she asked in a trembling voice. "They say the Colonel might be arrested, but he's always been so kind, always offering to drive me home when it's raining, asking after my aunt. He couldn't have done something so awful, could he?" Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Kindness, my dear, is a dangerous disguise. One must ask whether it springs from goodness or convenience. Tell me, did the Colonel ever speak to you about Mrs. Grey?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. "Once, just after she died, he said it was a pity, but that some women brought trouble upon themselves." "I thought it a cruel thing to say." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Cruel and careless. I've often found that those who moralize too freely are the ones most in need of forgiveness themselves. She left Lily with a reassuring pat on the arm and continued her walk, stopping only once to examine the roses outside Melrose House. They were pruned to near perfection, though she noticed that one bed near the tool shed had been freshly turned. She stood there for several minutes, gazing thoughtfully at the soil, until the faint sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. It was Colonel Melrose himself, his expression stiff but not unfriendly. "Admiring the roses again, Miss Marple?" he said with forced cheerfulness. "I hope the police haven't frightened you with their nonsense." "Oh, not at all," she said mildly. "I find nonsense rather refreshing. It so often leads to truth. You've kept your garden beautifully, Colonel. Such diligence, even in trying times, speaks well of you." He smiled thinly. "One must keep busy." "Yes, one must," she agreed, "particularly when one has things one would rather not think about. Gardening is most helpful for that, isn't it? So grounding, so cleansing." His eyes flickered. "You seem to have a great many opinions for someone who claims to be a simple observer." "Observation," Miss Marple said, meeting his gaze, "is the only honest occupation left to most of us." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the soft hiss of wind through the leaves. Then the Colonel said abruptly, "Mrs. Grey ruined lives, Miss Marple. She delighted in it. She called herself a guardian of morals, but she was nothing more than a gossip with delusions of grandeur. She blackmailed people, did you know that? Held secrets over them. I saw it destroy a young man once, years ago. She nearly ruined him. I told her if she ever tried it again—" He stopped himself, his breath coming faster. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. "And she did try again, didn't she? Only this time it was you she threatened. What was it she held, I wonder? Some foolishness in your army days? Or something nearer home?" He took a step back, his face pale. "You think I killed her? I think you feared she would make you small in the eyes of those who admired you, and pride, Colonel, can be a very desperate thing." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, harsh and hollow. "You can't prove anything." "I rarely can," she said, "until people prove it for me." That evening, as the lamps were lit in the cottages, and the last of the daylight faded, a constable came pounding up the lane to the police station, breathless and pale. Colonel Melrose had been found in his study, slumped over the desk, a glass beside him and a note folded neatly at his hand. When Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple arrived together, The scene was almost pitifully orderly. The note contained a brief confession, written with the same precision that had once marked the Colonel's garden rose. He had mixed the poison himself, from leaves taken from Mrs. Gray's own foxgloves, and slipped it into her sugar bowl the day before the party. He had meant only to make her ill, he wrote, to frighten her into silence. He had not intended death, but the hand once trained to kill cannot always measure mercy. Craddock read it aloud in silence, then folded it carefully. "So that's the end of it," he said at last. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her face unreadable. "No, Inspector, it's only the end of him. The roots of such things go far deeper. Pride, vanity, fear, they bloom again and again in every village. We prune them, but they always return." She looked down at the dying embers of the fire, then added softly, "One must tend one's garden, Inspector. Otherwise, even the prettiest roses can conceal poison." The days following Colonel Melrose's death passed in a quiet, uneasy haze. Though the official inquiry had concluded swiftly, his written confession leaving little room for doubt, St. Mary Mead remained unsettled. It was not merely the shock of another death that hung in the air like the lingering scent of rain, but something more elusive, a faint dissonance beneath the surface calm. The villagers tried, as villagers always do, to return to the rhythm of their days, yet whispers persisted in doorways and shop queues, carrying with them a vague sense that all was not yet resolved. Miss Marple, however, did not share in the villagers' relief. For her the Colonel's confession, though convenient, did not quite ring true. She had spent too many years listening to human excuses, reading what people meant rather than what they said, to mistake neatness for truth. The Colonel's letter had been precise, yes, but also curiously detached, an exercise in control rather than remorse. It lacked the tremor of emotion that comes from guilt truly felt. And then there was that final line, written in his firm, steady hand. "The hand once trained to kill cannot always measure mercy." To Miss Marple, it sounded not like confession, but justification. She sat in her parlour 3 mornings after his death, the fire low and the kettle just beginning to sing. On the table beside her lay the morning paper, folded open to a small column detailing the end of the Rose Garden tragedy, as the press had dubbed it. The language was predictably dramatic. Widow's death solved by hero's final act of conscience. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in quiet disapproval. Journalists, she thought, were so very fond of tidy endings, so much fonder, indeed, than truth itself. A soft knock came at the door. She rose, smoothing her shawl, and found Inspector Craddock standing on the step, looking less triumphant than one might have expected. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, offering a tired smile. "I suppose you've already read the papers." "Just now," she replied, ushering him in. "A very pretty story, if one likes that sort of thing. But not, I think, the right one." He sank into the chair nearest the fire, stretching his hands toward the warmth. "I might have known you'd say that. The chief's satisfied. Everything's been signed off. The public loves a confession, and the doctor says it was digitalis again, self-administered. The case is closed. Officially, perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but the truth, Inspector, does not bend itself to official documents." Craddock sighed. "Then tell me what's troubling you. You've had that look in your eyes since the night it happened." She poured him tea before answering. "It's the pattern, you see. The pieces don't fit as they should. The Colonel's death is far too convenient. He was a proud man, yes, perhaps guilty of something. But suicide? That seems most unlike him. and his confession, so elegantly worded, feels rehearsed. He frowned. Are you suggesting someone forged it? Oh, I don't think the letter itself was forged, she said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. It was written by him, certainly. But the question, Inspector, is why he wrote it, and under what persuasion. Craddock straightened. You think someone drove him to it? I think, she said gently, that someone frightened him, just as Mrs. Gray frightened him before she died. The inspector rubbed his temple. But who would have wanted him dead? The gossip's done for now. There's nothing left to hide. Ah, said Miss Marple with a small smile. But secrets are rather like foxgloves, Inspector. They seed themselves everywhere. You may pluck one, but there are always others waiting to bloom. She rose then, moving to the small writing desk by the window. From its drawer she withdrew a folded paper, an exact copy of the Colonel's confession, made before the police had removed the original. I took the liberty, she said mildly, of transcribing this while you were speaking with the coroner. Old habits die hard. Now do look closely at this line. The hand once trained to kill. It's curious, isn't it? It suggests not remorse, but pride, almost as though the act itself were something noble. Craddock leaned forward. You mean he didn't write it in despair, but to protect someone? Precisely. Or to obey someone, but who? Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. I wonder, Inspector, whether you recall who first found the Colonel's body. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce. She said she'd gone in to bring him his supper and found him at the desk. Him at the desk. Him, yes, Miss Marple murmured. And she was terribly flustered, wasn't she? Spoke rather too much about how devoted the Colonel had been to his duties. Devotion is an odd word for a servant, don't you think? It implies more than loyalty. It implies gratitude. One does wonder what she might have had to be grateful for. Craddock blinked. You think the housekeeper had something to do with this? I think, said Miss Marple, that Mrs. Pierce has spent a very long time keeping other people's secrets, and people who keep secrets, Inspector, sometimes learn to use them. By the afternoon, Miss Marple and Craddock were standing once more in the grand but comfortless hall of Melrose House. Mrs. Pierce, a wiry woman with an anxious manner, met them at the door. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands, "I didn't expect— well, the police have been and gone, haven't they? There's nothing more to be said." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said kindly, "but I wondered if I might trouble you for a few moments. You see, the inspector and I were discussing the Colonel's garden, and I thought you might help us recall how it looked before he passed." Mrs. Pierce hesitated, clearly torn between suspicion and politeness. "Well, I don't know that I can tell you much. The Colonel was particular about his roses, never let anyone else prune them." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "and yet such care must have been difficult to maintain after Mrs. Gray's death. I heard he took it quite badly." The housekeeper's face tightened. "He was upset, yes. She'd known things about him. Said things that weren't true. I told him not to listen, but he brooded on it." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did he often take his tea in the study in the evenings?" "Every evening," Mrs. Pierce said quickly. "I'd bring it in about 7. He'd sit there for hours, writing letters, or—" She stopped abruptly, biting her lip. "Or," Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Pierce's hands twisted in her apron. "He wasn't himself that last week. Snappish, nervous. Said there were things he had to put right. And that woman, Mrs. Cotterell, came one evening. Said she wanted to speak with him privately. I wasn't to mention it to anyone." Craddock's head jerked up. "Mrs. Cotterell? Are you sure?" "Oh, I'm sure," the housekeeper said miserably. "She looked dreadful, white as paper. I showed her into the study. She was there near an hour." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And after she left, he was calmer," Mrs. Pierce said, eyes darting nervously between them. but quiet. Didn't touch his supper. Went out to the garden later, though. It was dark by then. I remember because I saw the lamp in the shed." Miss Marple exchanged a brief glance with Craddock. "Thank you, Mrs. Pierce," she said kindly. "You've been most helpful." Outside, as they walked down the path, Craddock muttered, "So, it was her after all. She must have known he killed Mrs. Gray and used it against him. Perhaps he killed himself out of shame." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, Inspector. Not shame, fear, and I think Mrs. Cotterell knew precisely how to use that fear. The question is not whether she killed him, but whether she allowed him to live long enough to write what she wished him to write." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window as the first autumn chill crept through the village. She could see the faint glow of the Cotterells' windows across the green, steady and golden against the dark. It was a peaceful scene, outwardly perfect, and yet she could not shake the sense that beneath that calm lay something poisoned, something that had taken root long ago. She folded her hands in her lap and whispered, almost to herself, "People do not escape their pasts, no matter how tidy their gardens. The truth, like a seed, always finds the light." And as the church bell tolled 9, Miss Marple knew that before another day passed, she would have to visit Mrs. Cotterell once more, not as a friend nor even as an observer, but as the gardener who had finally traced every root to its poisonous heart. The next morning dawned cold and brittle, a thin frost silvering the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, and whitening the edges of the rose bushes that still clung stubbornly to the last of their blooms. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin, disciplined lines, and the village, so recently the stage for scandal, seemed now to hold its breath in waiting. The newspaper boys had stopped shouting headlines about the Rose Garden tragedy, but people's eyes still lingered too long on one another in the grocer's and at the post office. Every smile was tentative, every greeting cautious. Miss Marple noticed these small things as she took her morning walk toward the Cotterells' cottage, her gloved hands folded neatly over her umbrella handle. She had slept little. The knowledge that Mrs. Cotterell had visited Colonel Melrose on the evening of his death had woven itself into her dreams, bringing with it an image of two people locked in desperate conversation, the lamplight falling between them like a line of judgment. Miss Marple had woken certain of one thing. The truth was not yet complete. Colonel Melrose had been guilty, yes, but not of the whole crime. Someone else had guided his hand, and she suspected Mrs. Cotterell's calm exterior concealed more than fear. It concealed intention. As she approached the small house on the corner of Orchard Lane, she saw Mrs. Cotterell through the window, sitting very still at a writing desk. Her back was straight, her posture composed, and even from a distance there was an air of control about her that Miss Marple found telling. When she knocked there was a pause before the door opened, revealing the younger woman pale but collected, her dark hair neatly arranged, and her eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but cautious, "I rather thought you might come." "I hoped you wouldn't mind," Miss Marple replied with gentle politeness. "I wanted to see how you were managing after all that's happened." Mrs. Cotterell stepped aside. "Please come in. I was just finishing a letter." The sitting room was warm, the fire crackling softly, but there was an oppressive neatness about the space. No books out of place, no stray threads, no disorder at all. It was a room, Miss Marple thought, kept in control by someone who could not afford to let her mind wander. They sat across from one another, and for a moment there was only the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Cotterell poured tea with hands that did not tremble. "I suppose Inspector Craddock has told you that I visited the Colonel the night before he—" before he took his own life." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "He did mention it. You must have found the conversation very distressing." The other woman's lips tightened. "Distressing, yes. He confessed to me everything. That he poisoned Mrs. Gray. That he had taken the digitalis himself from Arthur's surgery. He said he'd acted out of fear and pride. I told him to tell the truth to make it right, but he said it was too late." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "he wrote that letter afterward. Such a careful, deliberate thing. He might almost have written it under instruction." Mrs. Cotterell's eyes flickered, the smallest tremor in her composure. "You think I told him what to say?" "I think," said Miss Marple, her tone still mild, "that you are a very intelligent woman who has spent many years living with the knowledge that one moment of indiscretion could destroy everything. You learned to be careful, perhaps too careful, and when Mrs. Gray threatened to expose your secret, you went to the Colonel. You reminded him that his own reputation would not survive if the truth came out." Mrs. Cotterell's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "You make it sound as though I blackmailed him." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said kindly. "You simply appealed to his sense of honour. You let him see that the only way to protect both your names was to take responsibility for the crime. You may not have meant for him to die, but you guided him to the edge, and he stepped off willingly enough." For a long moment, Mrs. Cotterell said nothing. The fire crackled, and outside a robin landed on the window-sill, peering in through the frost-dusted glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. You can't possibly understand what that woman did to me. She destroyed my first life before I ever came here. I was 17, foolish, and I trusted a man who promised marriage. Mrs. Gray found out. She helped me, yes, but she never let me forget. When I married Arthur, she wrote to me every year, reminding me what she knew, and then she threatened to tell him. Can you imagine that kind of torment?" "I can," Miss Marple said softly. "I have seen such things before. Women bound by the cruel morality of others. It is a dreadful burden. But even dreadful burdens do not justify murder." Mrs. Cotterell looked up sharply, her eyes glistening with sudden anger. "I didn't kill her." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But you didn't stop it either. You knew the Colonel was desperate. You knew what he meant to do, Her voice faltered. "He said he only meant to make her ill, to frighten her. He said she'd recover, that she'd learn humility. When he came to me after she died, he was broken. He begged me to help him to keep it secret. He said we'd both been her victims. And I believed him. I told him I'd stand by him, that together we could make it right. I never thought he'd—" She stopped, her hand pressing to her mouth. Miss Marple waited a moment before speaking. "People rarely mean to kill, Mrs. Cotterell, but once blood has been spilled, fear does the rest. You kept silent when you might have spoken, and when the police began to question him, you visited again. You reminded him that if he confessed, your secret would come out with his. So he wrote the letter. He spared you." Tears filled Mrs. Cotterell's eyes then, but she did not weep. "He was an old fool," she whispered. "He thought it chivalry. He said I'd suffered enough. And he was right, Miss Marple. I have." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Yes, I believe you have. But suffering does not cleanse what we hide. The truth has a way of demanding to be known. The question, my dear, is what you intend to do about it now." Mrs. Cotterell stared into the fire. "If I tell the truth, it will ruin Arthur. He's done nothing. But the shame will cling to him all the same. Do you really think the village would forgive me?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Forgiveness is not the village's to give. It is something one must earn from oneself. Confession can be painful, yes, but silence corrodes, Mrs. Cotterell. It eats away at the soul, and it will find you out in the end. I have lived long enough to know that one cannot keep peace by burying sin. The ground, as they say, never forgets. The younger woman turned away, her shoulders trembling, though her voice remained steady. "You're very cruel, Miss Marple." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "just honest." When she left the cottage, the frost had begun to melt, and the air carried the scent of damp earth. She walked slowly down the lane toward her own home, her thoughts heavy but resolute. She did not know whether Mrs. Cotterill would go to Inspector Craddock, but she suspected the matter would not rest much longer. Truth had a way of working its way through even the most careful disguises. That evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by her fire, there was a knock at the door. It was Craddock again, his expression sombre. "We've had a visitor," he said quietly. "Mrs. Cotterill came to the station an hour ago. She's made a statement. Said Colonel Melrose killed Mrs. Grey, but that she knew he planned it and did nothing to stop him. She's asked to be charged as an accessory." Miss Marple's needles stilled. "And her husband?" "He's gone to stay with his brother. Seems he'd suspected something for some time, but never pressed her. Poor fellow's heartbroken, though he says he'll stand by her as best he can." Miss Marple sighed, setting her knitting aside. "It is always the innocent who pay the highest price, Inspector. Still, perhaps now the village may rest. There is nothing so dangerous as a lie allowed to ripen." Craddock nodded. "You were right from the start, of course. How do you always see it before the rest of us?" She smiled faintly. "Because I pay attention to people, Inspector. Roses, foxgloves, secrets. They all grow according to their nature. You need only know the soil." He looked at her for a long moment, then laughed quietly. "I'll remember that." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in silence. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of her garden, and somewhere beyond the hedge, a single rose, late and stubborn, trembled in the cold. She rose, went to the window, and looked out at it, her face unreadable. "Poor souls," she murmured. "So much pride, so much fear, and all for nothing. The world would be a kinder place if people only learned to tend their hearts as carefully as their gardens." She closed the curtains then, the firelight flickering against the walls. In the stillness that followed, the village at last seemed to exhale, a long, weary sigh of release. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the calm earth of St. Mary Mead, another seed of tragedy might already be taking root, waiting for its season to bloom. The following week brought an unseasonable warmth to St. Mary Mead, a soft reprieve after the bitter frost. The village seemed to thaw both in temperature and in spirit, though an undercurrent of unease still lingered. The newspapers had moved on to other scandals, and yet, in drawing-rooms and shop queues, people still spoke of Mrs. Grey, Colonel Melrose, and the quiet woman who had confessed too late. It was not malice that kept the gossip alive. Rather, the curiosity of people trying to understand how wickedness could bloom in so familiar a soil. Miss Marple, for her part, did not join the speculation. She moved through her days with her usual composure, tending her garden, visiting Mrs. Bantry for tea, and keeping a watchful eye on the small rhythms of the village. Yet something in her manner had grown thoughtful, almost sad. The truth, after all, had not brought peace. Mrs. Cotterill had been taken to London for formal proceedings, her husband remaining behind in quiet humiliation. Colonel Melrose lay buried beside the churchyard path, his grave covered with flowers left by those who, in death, forgave what they might have condemned in life. And Mrs. Grey, the cause of it all, was still spoken of with that uneasy mixture of pity and distaste reserved for those whose sins had died with them. Miss Marple was in her garden one afternoon, pruning the last of her withered roses, when Inspector Craddock came walking up the lane. He looked older, she thought, than he had a month ago, and though his step was brisk, his expression carried a kind of weariness she recognized all too well, the fatigue of a man who has seen justice done but not restored. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she said pleasantly, straightening and removing her gloves. "You look as though you've come for a cup of tea rather than business." "I'll not refuse one," he said with a half-smile. "The train back to town isn't till 6. She led him inside, and as they settled by the fire he sighed, removing his hat and setting it carefully on the table. "It's over, officially speaking. Mrs. Cotterell pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. The magistrate's shown leniency, probation, not prison. Seems everyone agrees she's been punished enough by her conscience." Miss Marple poured tea in silence, her face unreadable. "And her husband?" "Resigned from his practice. Going abroad, I hear. A relative in Canada. Can't say I blame him." Craddock stirred his tea absently, then added, "I never thought I'd pity the Colonel, but I almost do. He was a proud man. She broke him in the end." "Not she," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Pride broke him, and fear. Mrs. Grey merely pointed the way." He nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. Still, I can't help feeling that justice never looks quite as tidy as it should. There's always a stain left somewhere." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Justice is not a teacup, Inspector. It doesn't stay clean, however carefully one handles it. People's lives are not tidy things. They spill, they bruise. One must simply do one's best to wipe the edges." They sat for a time in companionable quiet. Outside, the faint hum of bees drifted through the open window, and the sun fell in golden slants across the rug. Then Craddock said, almost reluctantly, "There is one thing still puzzling me, Miss Marple. You may have an opinion on it." "I usually do," she replied, eyes twinkling faintly. "It's that silver button, the one found in Mrs. Grey's garden early on. We never traced it properly. It didn't belong to her, and it wasn't the Colonel's or Finch's either. I've turned it over and over in my mind, but I can't see how it fits." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Ah, yes, the button. So easily overlooked, and yet it's often the smallest things that illuminate the largest. You remember Mrs. Pierce, the Colonel's housekeeper?" Of course. She wore a uniform with buttons of that very sort. She'd been with the Melroses for years, hadn't she? Quite devoted to him, I think you said." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting she was in Mrs. Grey's garden?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said mildly, "that she knew more than she ever told you. Devotion, Inspector, can be a dangerous thing when it curdles into worship. The Colonel may have been guilty of murder, yes, but perhaps he had an accomplice. Not in planning, but in concealment. You see, Mrs. Pierce was not a fool. When Mrs. Grey died, she would have known something was wrong, and when the Colonel began to panic, she might have helped tidy matters away. It would explain how the will was found so conveniently, and why the vial of digitalis reappeared in the surgery after it had been missing. A faithful servant protecting her master." Craddock stared at her, astonished. "Oh, good Lord! Do you really think she knew?" "I think she suspected and acted accordingly. She would have told herself it was loyalty. We all invent noble names for our failings." He shook his head slowly. "That's possible, I suppose. But she's gone now. Left the village last week. Said she couldn't bear the reminders." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "Guilt is a poor companion in small communities. It demands solitude to grow properly." Craddock laughed softly, though the sound carried no mirth. "You do have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. I sometimes wonder how you can speak so calmly about such terrible matters. Age, Inspector. One grows used to human frailty. It's like living near the sea. You stop expecting it not to flood. When he left, the light was already beginning to fade. Miss Marple watched him walk down the lane until he disappeared around the bend, then turned back to her fire. The teapot sat cooling on the tray, the last of the steam curling faintly upward like a sigh. For a long moment she stood in thought, then crossed to her writing desk. From a small drawer she drew out a folded piece of paper, a note creased from handling. It was addressed to her in Mrs. Cotterell's careful hand. It had arrived that morning, slipped through her letterbox without ceremony. She unfolded it now, and read once more the simple lines within. Miss Marple, you were right, as always. I could not bear the lie any longer. But I thank you for your kindness, and for speaking the truth to me without cruelty. Perhaps in another life I might have been brave sooner. Please look after the roses. I have left some bulbs in the garden. They are foxgloves, but white ones this time. No more poison in their beauty. There was no signature, only a faint trace of perfume. Miss Marple folded the paper again, her eyes soft with something like sorrow. Then she rose, took her shawl, and stepped outside into the evening. The air was cool and still, and the first stars had begun to appear above the roofs of the cottages. She walked slowly through her garden, pausing beside the rose bed where the new bulbs had been planted. The soil was dark and fresh, the young shoots just breaking through. She crouched, touching one tender leaf with her fingertips. "White foxgloves," she murmured, "so even guilt can try for innocence." Her gaze lifted toward the horizon, where the last of the sunlight was fading into violet dusk. In the distance the church bell began to toll, soft, steady, unhurried. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, then turned back toward the house. Inside, the fire still glowed warmly, and her knitting lay waiting on the arm of the chair. She settled into it, the soft clicking of needles filling the silence. Her thoughts moved gently, unhurried, through the events that had so recently shaken the village. The pattern was clear now. Each thread accounted for pride, fear, love, and the quiet desperation that had tied them all together. And yet, even with the truth revealed, there was no satisfaction in it, only a weary understanding. Murder, she reflected, was never born of monsters but of ordinary hearts too frightened to bear themselves. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did. The gossip would fade, the roses would bloom again, and life would resume its pleasant, deceptive calm. But Miss Marple would remember. She always did. As the clock struck 9, she laid her knitting aside and gazed into the fire. The flames shifted and whispered softly, casting golden light across her face. Outside, the village slept beneath its quiet stars, unaware of the old woman who sat wakeful among the shadows, thinking, as she so often did, of the curious frailty of human nature and the thin, perilous line that separates respectability from ruin. Then, with a small sigh, she reached for her teacup, found it cold, and smiled faintly to herself. "Ah, well," she murmured, "one can always brew another." And as the night deepened around her cottage, the garden outside stood still beneath the moonlight, the pale foxgloves swaying faintly in the breeze, innocent now, but with roots sunk deep in the same soil that had fed the sins of the living. The winter that followed settled gently over St. Mary Mead, muffling the world in quiet and slowing even the busiest gossip. The scandal that had so consumed the village became, with time, a story to be spoken of only in lowered voices. An unhappy tale from last autumn, the sort people recalled over tea, but soon replaced with talk of parish fates and the vicar's sermons. The roses in the vicarage garden had long since lost their bloom, and Mrs. Harper, ever determined to restore cheer, had announced plans for an early spring planting. to put the whole dreadful business behind us." Miss Marple approved, though privately she knew that flowers could not so easily mask what lingered beneath. Evil, in her long experience, was not a visitor that left when the door was shut. It stayed faint but persistent, in the air like a scent. Yet she also knew that life must go on, that healing came not from forgetting, but from understanding. One cold afternoon in January, Inspector Craddock returned to St. Mary Mead on an errand that was half official, half personal. He found Miss Marple, as he always did, in her sitting-room with her knitting, the fire burning low and the faint smell of lavender polish in the air. She welcomed him with her usual gentle smile and the offer of tea. "It's been a long while since I've troubled you, Miss Marple," he said, easing himself into the chair by the hearth. "I wanted to let you know the Cotterell case is fully closed now. Mrs. Cotterell's left the country. Went quietly, no fuss. The doctors joined her. They've settled in Canada, apparently. Fresh start and all that. How very sensible," she said softly. "It's what one should do when the past grows too heavy for one's shoulders." Craddock nodded, though there was a hesitation in his manner, as though something remained unsaid. "It's a funny thing," he went on. "All through this business I kept thinking of that poor colonel. Everyone saw him as the villain, but in the end he was just another pawn, wasn't he? Caught in something larger than himself." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-click. "Yes," she murmured. "That's often the way of it. People think murder is born in a single moment, out of passion or greed. But it isn't. It's sown little by little, in vanity, in fear, in resentment that festers. By the time the act comes, it is only the harvest." He gave a rueful smile. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "Not inevitable," she said gently. "Simply human." There was a long silence then, the sort that falls between two people who have seen too much and said just enough. The fire crackled softly, and outside a thrush sang in the bare hedge, its song oddly hopeful against the chill. After a while, Craddock reached into his pocket. "There's one last thing," he said. "When they cleared out the colonel's study, they found this tucked behind a drawer. I thought it might interest you." He handed her a small notebook, its leather worn smooth by time. Miss Marple opened it delicately, turning the pages with care. Inside were sketches of the colonel's garden, neat diagrams of rosebeds and notes written in a precise, soldierly hand. But between two pages near the end, pressed flat and dry, lay a single white foxglove bloom. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment, her face unreadable. "How curious," she said softly. "It seems our story ends where it began, with a flower." Craddock frowned. "Do you think he meant something by it?" "Oh, yes," she said quietly. "Regret, perhaps, or remembrance. It may even have been Mrs. Cotterell who placed it there later, a symbol of what they both lost. Innocence, perhaps, though I've never thought much of innocence. It's rather like glass, pretty to look at, but easily shattered. Far better, I think, to be tempered by experience, like steel. It bends, but it does not break." He studied her with an expression of half-admiring puzzlement. "You're a philosopher, Miss Marple," she smiled. "A gardener, Inspector. The difference is mostly in the tools." He laughed quietly, and for the first time in months the sound did not carry heaviness. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in silence, the notebook resting in her lap. She looked again at the white foxglove, its pale petals ghostly in the fading light. Later, as dusk crept in, she went out into her garden. The air was sharp, scented faintly with wood smoke and the promise of snow. She moved to the flower bed by the path and crouched there, touching the soil gently. The bulbs Mrs. Cotterell had planted were beginning to stir beneath the earth, patient and unseen. Life, Miss Marple thought, had a way of returning even to places where death had lingered longest. She brushed the soil from her gloves and stood, gazing at the small cottages scattered around the village, the lights glowing warmly in their windows, the sound of distant laughter from the pub. It was all so ordinary, so peaceful, and yet beneath that calm she knew there would always be secrets, small cruelties, hidden griefs, quiet acts of love and cowardice. The world, she reflected, was not divided between the wicked and the good. Most souls simply stumbled between the two, guided by weakness, chance, and the faint, stubborn hope of being forgiven. She returned inside, closing the door softly behind her. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with the tender hush of evening. As she settled once more into her chair, her eyes fell upon the newspaper folded on the table. The headline spoke of Parliament and politics, of affairs far removed from her quiet life, but beneath it ran a small notice. St. Mary Mead Garden Society to resume annual rose competition this spring. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah," she murmured, "how very English of us! The roses must go on." She reached for her knitting, her fingers steady, her heart calm. The needles clicked softly in the growing dark, a rhythm as old and sure as the village itself. Outside, the first snowflakes drifted down, settling on the sleeping gardens, covering the scars of autumn in a clean, white hush, and in the little house on Old Mill Lane, Miss Marple worked by the firelight, her mind at peace at last, knowing, as she always did, that evil was never vanquished, only understood, and that understanding was the truest form of justice there could ever be.